The door was there when she arrived, and she had not been told about it. It stood at the far end of the corridor the housekeeper called the long gallery, tucked between a tapestry of hunting dogs and a pier glass that had lost most of its silver. The door was oak, older than the rest of the wing by at least a century, its panels darkened to near black and its brass fittings gone green with verdigris. Someone had placed a chair in front of it. Not blocking it, precisely. Only suggesting that a person with sense would not go further. Cecily Ashmore, now Countess of Ardenvale for precisely 11 days, stood in the long gallery in her traveling clothes and looked at the door and felt something she could not quite name. Not fear. She was 22 years old. The daughter of a solicitor who had raised her on Greek and Roman history rather than on the usual accomplishments. And she did not frighten easily. What she felt was more like the sensation of arriving at the end of a sentence and finding no period. She had come to Ardenvale Park from her father's house in Shropshire, which smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular comfort of a home that had held one family for 3 generations. She had married the Earl of Ardenvale on a Tuesday in October, in a ceremony attended by her father, her cousin Dorothea, the Earl's solicitor, his land steward, and a vicar who hurried through the service as though he had another engagement pressing. The Earl himself had stood at the altar in dark blue and white and watched the proceedings with the concentrated expression of a man reviewing a legal document. He had said the words correctly. He had placed the ring. He had not smiled. She had not expected him to smile. The marriage had been her father's arrangement, made during his final illness when it became clear that the small house in Shropshire and the £300 Cecily would inherit were not enough to sustain her alone. The Earl of Ardenvale was a man who needed a wife for reasons that were never made entirely plain to her. A letter had arrived. Negotiations had proceeded with the brisk efficiency of a property transfer. Cecily had read the terms twice, asked 2 clarifying questions that clearly surprised the solicitor, and signed. She was practical by nature. She had understood what the arrangement was. What she had not understood was the West Wing. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pendlewick, was a woman of 60, with a face arranged into an expression of permanent mild anxiety. She had met Cecily at the door with correct courtesy, conducted her through the principal rooms of Ardenvale Park, named the servants, explained the arrangement of the kitchens and the morning room and the dining room that seated 30, and said nothing whatsoever about the long gallery or the door at its end. Cecily had only found it because she had taken a wrong turning looking for the library. She studied the chair in front of the door. She studied the door itself. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come, and went in search of the Earl. He was in his study, which meant she had to knock on a door and wait. And the wait was long enough that she wondered whether she was meant to wait at all. When the door finally opened, it was not the Earl, but a young man she had not yet been introduced to, who blinked at her and stepped aside with a brief bow. "The Countess," the young man said, apparently to the room. The Earl looked up from the desk. He was 34, lean in a way that suggested not refinement, but economy. His hair very dark, his face arranged into that same concentrated expression she had first seen at the altar. His eyes were gray. She had noticed this at the wedding, and she noticed it again now. Not cold, precisely. Conserved. "My lady," he said, and rose. The courtesy was correct and immediate. "I beg your pardon for the interruption," she said. "I would have waited." But I was not certain whether waiting was the correct procedure. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "My house is your house. You do not require procedure." She took this information in and set it aside for later consideration. "I found a door," she said, "in the long gallery. Someone has placed a chair in front of it. A pause, brief but weighted. "The West Wing," he said. "Yes, I assumed. I came to ask whether I ought not to go into it." "You ought not to go into it." She waited. He did not elaborate. She said, "I see. Is it structurally unsound?" "No." "Is there something dangerous within it?" "No." "Then I confess I do not entirely understand the prohibition, and I would rather understand it than simply observe it." The young man who had opened the door made a small sound that might have been a suppressed cough. The Earl looked at her with an expression she could not parse, and then said, "I will explain it when I am able. For the present, I would ask that you trust the instruction." She was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who accepted unexplained instructions gracefully, and she suspected he could see this. "Very well," she said at last. "I will trust the instruction." She paused. For the present. She could not be certain, but she thought the corner of his mouth moved. Only slightly. Only for a moment. Then the expression settled back into its conserved stillness, and she excused herself and went to find the library by a different route. If anyone in the county wished to know what the new Countess of Ardenvale was like, they had only to observe her at the Milverton Assembly Rooms that November, 3 weeks after her arrival at Ardenvale Park. She stood near the wall in an ivory gown she had trimmed herself, watching the room with the patient attention of someone who has recently arrived in a foreign country and is still learning the customs. She had refused 3 partners because she did not dance well enough to enjoy public dancing, and this refusal had been noted and reported to Lady Whitmore, who was the dowager of the neighborhood in all but legal title. Lady Whitmore was 62, possessed of a fortune and a daughter, and an opinion on every subject introduced within her hearing. Her daughter, Miss Lavinia Whitmore, was 26 and beautiful in the specific way of a woman who has been told repeatedly that she is beautiful and has arrived at a calm certainty of it. The Earl of Ardenvale had danced with Lavinia Whitmore at the Assembly Rooms every quarter for 3 years. He had called at Whitmore Hall on several occasions. Lady Whitmore had spoken confidently of a union, in private, for at least 2 of those years. He had, instead, married a solicitor's daughter from Shropshire, who did not dance, and who stood near walls. "She is plain," Lady Whitmore said to Mrs. Penrose, behind her fan, watching Cecily across the room. "A pleasant enough face, I suppose, but no distinction. No address, no family to speak of. One wonders what he was thinking." Mrs. Penrose made the appropriate murmur of agreement. "I have no doubt," Lady Whitmore continued, "that the girl is perfectly adequate in her station. She simply has no business being out of it." Cecily, across the room, could not hear these words. She had spent enough time in assembly rooms, however, to understand the general meaning of a fan held at that angle and a gaze directed at her person with that particular combination of assessment and dismissal. She was not wounded by it. She had expected something of the sort. She was more interested in watching the Earl, who stood near the windows at the far end of the room with a glass he had not drunk from, and an expression he was not quite managing to keep composed. He was watching her. Not the way men sometimes watched unfamiliar women in assembly rooms, which was a look that measured and categorized. He was watching her the way she had watched the West Wing door, as though he was trying to understand something and had not yet arrived at an answer. She did not acknowledge it. She turned and accepted a cup of tea from a passing footman and pretended to be absorbed in the general observation of the room. Later, in the carriage home, he said, "You did not dance?" "No." "You were asked." 3 times. I declined." A pause. "You do not dance?" "I dance tolerably. I do not dance well enough to enjoy it in a public room, and I see no virtue in performing badly for the entertainment of strangers." Another pause. She could see, in the dark of the carriage, that he was looking at her again with that same expression she could not name. "Lady Whitmore will say you are proud," he said. "She will say worse than that. She was saying it already, with her fan." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Her observations are not worth your attention." "I know. I was not attending to them." She looked out the window at the dark fields. "I was attending to you." She had not meant to say it quite so plainly. She had said it nonetheless, and he was very still beside her, and the carriage moved through the night, and neither of them spoke again for the remainder of the drive home. If you have ever wanted a story that stays with you long after the last page, I think you will want to stay close to this one. You are welcome to leave a thought in the comments when you reach the end. The library at Ardenvale Park held 4,000 volumes and a fire that was lit every morning, whether or not anyone intended to use the room. Cecily had discovered this within her first week and had begun spending her mornings there with a regularity that seemed to surprise Mrs. Pendlewick, though the housekeeper's surprise was expressed only by arriving with tea at increasingly perfect intervals, which Cecily chose to interpret as approval. It was in the library, on a Thursday morning in December, that the Earl found her reading Clarendon's History of the Rebellion, her feet tucked beneath her on the window seat, in a posture that was almost certainly not appropriate for a countess. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "I did not know you were a reader of history," he said. "My father kept no novels," she said. "I read what was available." He came into the room and looked at the spine of the book. And then he looked at her with that expression again, the one she had come to think of as his listening expression, as though she was a document he was attempting to translate. "Clarendon," he said, not the usual reading of a young woman with time on her hands. "I have always found Clarendon clarifying," she said. "He makes plain that the people who believed themselves most secure in their position were usually the ones least capable of understanding why it was about to end." A silence. He sat down in the chair across from her window seat, which surprised her, because in 6 weeks of marriage he had not sat in the same room with her for longer than the time required by courtesy. "And do you find that applicable to the present moment?" he said. "I find it applicable to most historical moments," she said, which was not quite an answer, and he knew it, and she could see from his expression that he did. "Your grandmother's portrait is in this room," she added, by way of redirecting the conversation. "I have been looking at her in the intervals between chapters. She has a decided face." He looked at the portrait. The woman in it was perhaps 50, painted in the fashion of 60 years ago. Her expression arranged into the particular look of someone who expects to be painted and has opinions about how. "She did," he said. "She kept the estate through her husband's illness and death and the minority of my father. 17 years? Alone?" "Mostly alone." Cecily looked at the portrait again. She thought of the West Wing. She thought of all the rooms in Ardenvale Park she had been welcomed into, and the one she had been asked not to enter. "She looks," Cecily said carefully, "as though she was the sort of person who understood that some questions have their answer in the room to which they are attached, and that patience is not the same as compliance." He was very still. "I am not planning to go into the West Wing," she said. "I told you I would trust the instruction, and I will. I am only saying that I notice it is still there." "It is still there," he agreed very quietly. "That is all I wish to say." She looked back at her book. "I will not ask again. When you are ready to explain, I expect you will." She heard him exhale. Not a sigh, precisely. Something more like a careful release of air that had been held too long. He did not leave immediately, which she had expected. He remained in the chair across from her, and she read, and the fire settled in the grate, and the room held them both in a silence that was, for the first time since she had arrived at Ardenvale Park, not uncomfortable. The explanation came in January. In the blue parlor, without preamble, on a gray afternoon while sleet moved against the windows. She had been writing letters at the small desk near the fire. He came in and stood near the mantelpiece, and she set down her pen and waited. "My first wife died in the West Wing," he said. She did not fill the silence. She let it hold the shape of what he had said. "4 years ago," he continued. "In the spring. She had been unwell for most of the winter, and we had been told to expect the worst, and the worst arrived in April." He looked at the fire. She was 29. We had been married 6 years. She was the person who understood the estate and the tenants and the proper running of this house better than I did, and when she died, I closed that wing because I could not, at that time, face the practicality of reopening it. "And since then?" "Since then it has remained closed. There is nothing wrong with the rooms. The housekeeper airs them. The windows are maintained. It is only that I have not been able to cross that threshold without feeling that I am doing something I have not yet been given permission to do." Cecily was quiet for a moment. She said, "What was she like?" He looked at her sharply. She thought perhaps he had expected a different question. "She was," he said, and then stopped and began again. "She was the most capable person I have ever known. She was also the only person who told me plainly when I was wrong about a thing, and she was right on most occasions." He paused. "I was wrong about several things toward the end of her illness. I was not present in the ways I should have been. I believed work was a form of caring. I have since understood that it was not." The sleet moved against the glass. Cecily looked at him steadily. "I married again," he said, "because Ardenvale requires continuity, and because I could not give my attention to the question forever. The solicitor who managed my wife's estate was your father, and your father was dying. And the arrangement seemed to me to have a kind of logic that I trusted more than I trusted my own judgment on the matter. And now you are uncertain whether the logic was correct." He looked at her. "I am uncertain of a great many things." She nodded slowly. She picked up her pen again. Not to write, but because she needed something to hold. "I think," she said carefully, "that a man who believes he failed his first wife by not being present in the ways that matter is perhaps making an effort to correct that error with his second. I have noticed that you are present in the room more often than the arrangement strictly requires. I have noticed that you ask questions whose answers you are not obligated to pursue. I have noticed that you came and sat in the library last Thursday and said nothing in particular, which a man who wished only to discharge an obligation would not have done." He was very still. "I am not asking you to open the West Wing," she said. "I am only asking you to understand that I am not in competition with the woman who lived in it." The fire shifted. The sleet continued. He stood at the mantelpiece with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who has prepared himself for something to be difficult and has discovered, against his expectation, that it is not. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not my lady, not the Countess. Her name, which she had not known he knew how to say in quite that register, low and careful, as though it was something he had been practicing without being aware of it. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Lady Whitmore came to call in February, which Cecily had expected, and brought Lavinia with her, which Cecily had also expected, and arrived with an expression of bright social warmth that did not quite obscure the fact of the visit's real purpose. They were received in the drawing-room, with tea, and the ritual of inquiries about health and weather was conducted correctly on both sides. Cecily watched Lavinia Whitmore look at the room with the specific attention of a woman who has been told she ought to have owned it, and she did not look away. "The park is looking well," Lady Whitmore said. "Cecily, you have settled in very quickly. One would almost think you had been here for years." The use of her given name without invitation was the first transgression, and it was small enough to ignore. "I find Ardenvale comfortable," Cecily said. "The library alone would reconcile me to any arrangement." "A reader," Lady Whitmore said, with the tone of someone who has received information they were not expecting and has not decided what to do with it. "How charming! Lavinia, do you not find that charming?" "Very much so," Lavinia said. She was looking at the mantelpiece now, at the arrangement of the ornaments on it, with an expression that Cecily realized was genuine grief rather than calculation. This was a woman who had believed, for 3 years, that this room would be hers. The grief was real, and it was not Cecily's to address. "I understand," Lady Whitmore continued, resettling herself with the air of someone approaching a subject that has been carefully prepared, "that you have not yet opened the West Wing. Is that not rather a waste of perfectly good rooms for a household of this size?" So there it was. "The West Wing remains as Lord Ardenvale has arranged it," Cecily said pleasantly. "I would not alter any arrangement of his without his agreement. But surely, as mistress of the house, you have the prerogative." "I have a great many prerogatives," Cecily said. "I prefer to consider which ones are worth exercising." Lady Whitmore's fan, which she had not opened, moved slightly in her hand. "The poor man has grieved long enough," she said, and her voice carried something that was almost genuine feeling beneath the strategy of it. "Whatever his reasons, a house cannot hold itself in amber forever. The West Wing was Lady Ardenvale's domain. It should be someone's domain again." "Yes," Cecily agreed. "I expect it will be, when the time is right." "And you are content to wait indefinitely?" Cecily looked at Lady Whitmore directly. "I am content to understand that some things require patience, and some things require time, and that confusing the two has never yet produced a good outcome in any situation I have observed." She smiled. "More tea?" It was later, when the carriage had gone and Cecily was still in the drawing room with the fire and the remnants of the tea service, that she heard his step in the corridor. She had not known he was in the house. He came in and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was the expression that meant he had been nearby and had heard more than she intended him to hear. "You did not need to defend the arrangement," he said. "I know," she said. "I was not defending it for your sake. I was defending it because it is correct." She looked at the fire. "Lady Whitmore is not wrong that the house cannot hold itself in amber forever. She is only wrong about whose decision that is." "Whose decision is it?" She met his gaze. "Yours. And when it is ready to be shared, you will share it." He stood in the doorway of the drawing room for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat down across from her in the chair nearest the fire, and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the fire burned low and warm between them. And this was, she would think later, the afternoon that something shifted in the house, like a season changing without anyone deciding to turn the page. In March, the Earl of Ardenvale invited his nearest neighbors to dinner, which he had not done in 4 years, and Cecily sat at the head of the table opposite him and managed the conversation and the seating, and the several small crises that attend any dinner of 18 people with the quiet competence that had apparently surprised his steward, Mr. Norris, who had pulled her aside beforehand with genuine anxiety about the wine and the placement of a cousin whose political views were incompatible with those of a general. She had resolved both questions in 3 sentences and sent him away calm. The dinner was a success. She knew this. Not because anyone said so, though several people did, but because at the end of it, when the last carriage had departed and the house had settled into its night silence, the Earl found her in the hallway removing her gloves and said, "I have been told by Mr. Norris that you managed him earlier with considerable precision." "He was anxious about the general," she said. "I separated them by 2 seats and gave the general a neighbor who was deaf in the relevant ear. It seemed the simplest solution." He made a sound she had not heard before from him, which was a sound almost like a laugh, arrested just before it became one. She looked up. His expression was not composed. It was open, and a little surprised, and entirely unguarded, and she had an odd, vertiginous awareness of how much she liked looking at his face when it was like that. "You are," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "You are not what I expected," he said, "when I agreed to the arrangement." "What did you expect?" He considered the question with the gravity she had come to recognize as genuine rather than performed. "Someone quieter," he said at last. "Someone who would manage the house and trouble me as little as possible." "And instead?" "Instead," he said, "I find I am troubled in a manner I had not anticipated, and that I do not particularly wish to resolve." She held very still. The hallway was cool and dim, and the candles were burning low, and he was 2 feet from her. And she was aware of him in the specific way she had been trained by 6 weeks of marriage to ignore, but had not, in fact, managed to ignore. "I should like to show you something," he said. "Tomorrow morning, if you are willing." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I am willing." She did not sleep well. She lay in her room and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about his face in the hallway when it had been open and unguarded, and briefly, entirely, his. She thought about 4 years of a closed door and a chair placed in front of it, not to prevent, but only to suggest. She thought about a man who had confused work with caring, and had spent 4 years understanding the difference. She thought that grief was not a room you left when you were done with it. It was a room that left you, slowly, when it was ready. In the morning he came to the library at 8 o'clock, which was where she was, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Come with me." He led her through the house in the particular silence of a winter morning, past the long gallery with its tapestries and its pier glass and its cold light, to the door at the far end. He moved the chair. He took a key from his coat pocket. She understood then why she had sometimes seen his hand move to that pocket and stop. What the habit of reaching for it and pulling back had cost him. He opened the door. The west wing was cold, as rooms are when they have been closed through a winter, but not damp, not decayed. The morning light came in through windows that had been properly maintained, and the rooms were full of furniture covered in Holland cloth, and a piano that had been left uncovered, which she noticed at once. He stood in the doorway of the first room and did not go in. She understood that he was not yet able to go in. She stepped across the threshold instead, and turned, and looked at him. "The piano," she said. She played, he said. His voice was level in the way of a man keeping it level with deliberate attention. "Every evening after dinner. I did not understand, until she could not, how much of the house was held together by that sound." Cecily looked at the piano. It was a fine instrument, rosewood, the kind that had been chosen by someone with both taste and practice. She looked at the room around it. She thought of a woman who had managed this house for 6 years and understood it better than her husband, and who had played in the evenings, and who had left this wing in the middle of a phrase that had never been completed. "I do not play well," she said. "I learned as a child, but I was never diligent enough to become competent. And I've always been honest about my limitations." She paused. "I could learn again, if you would like the sound back in the house." He looked at her across the threshold of the room. "It would not be the same sound," she said. "It would be a different sound entirely. Likely worse. For some time. I am warning you." Something happened in his face then, which was not quite the expression she had seen in the hallway, but was of the same family. His jaw was tight for a moment, and then it was not, and his eyes were very still. And she thought he was a man who had carried something for 4 years, and was discovering what it felt like to put it down. "Cecily," he said. "Just that. Her name." She held his gaze. She said, "Come in." He crossed the threshold. She did not move toward him, and he did not immediately move toward her. They stood in the cold West Wing room with the covered furniture and the uncovered piano, and he looked at the room and at the piano and at her. And she let him look, and the morning light moved through the maintained windows. And it was enough. It was, for the present, entirely enough. He put his hand out. She looked at it, and then she gave him hers. And his fingers closed around it with a steadiness that was deliberate and chosen, and not at all the careful courtesy of the altar. But something else. Something she recognized from the way certain sentences in certain books resolve after many pages into something you did not know you had been waiting for. They stood like that for a long time, in the cold room that had been closed 4 years, while the light moved and the house breathed around them. The formal dinner at Whitmore Hall was held in April, and the Earl and Countess of Ardenvale attended, which gave Lady Whitmore and her daughter a further opportunity to take stock of the situation as it had developed, and which Cecily understood perfectly and had dressed for accordingly, in a gown of pale green that was not showy, but was precisely right in the way that things chosen with attention, and no vanity, generally are. She sat at dinner between a colonel and a magistrate, and managed both of them easily, and watched the Earl across the table do the same with a Viscountess and an elderly baronet, and discovered that what she felt watching him was something she had not, in January, expected to feel. A kind of warmth that was not comfortable, precisely, but was very specific, and was pointed at him, alone. He caught her looking. He did not look away first. Lady Whitmore, observing this exchange from her position at the head of the table, said something quietly to Lavinia beside her. Lavinia looked at the tablecloth. After dinner, in the drawing-room, Lady Whitmore found occasion to remark, within Cecily's hearing, and that of Mrs. Penrose and the vicar's wife, that she thought it a great pity the west wing of Ardenvale Park had been reopened. It was the late Lady Ardenvale's particular domain, she said. One would have thought the new countess would have the delicacy to leave it undisturbed. Some rooms ought to be left in peace, Mrs. Penrose murmured. The vicar's wife looked at her hands. Cecily turned from the window where she had been standing and said pleasantly, across the 12 feet between them, "The west wing is open again. Yes. Lord Ardenvale opened it himself, in March. He is the custodian of his own house and his own past, and he was ready. I am glad he was." The room was briefly very quiet. Lady Whitmore opened her fan. "One naturally assumes," she said, with the specific smoothness of a woman retreating to higher ground, "that a new wife would have had some influence on the decision." "One would be incorrect," Cecily said. "I said nothing about the West Wing after January. He came to the matter himself, in his own time. I believe that is how grief works, when one permits it to. The silence lasted precisely long enough to be felt. Then the Earl said, from the doorway where he had apparently arrived unnoticed a sentence and a half ago, in a voice that was very calm and very clear. My wife is correct in every particular. He crossed the room and stood beside her, which was a statement in itself, in the geography of a Regency drawing room, where position was language. The West Wing is open. The house is itself again. And I am grateful to the Countess not for any influence she exerted, but for the patience with which she permitted a thing to come to its own time. Lady Whitmore looked at him. She looked at Cecily. She looked at the fan in her hand, which had gone very still. How lovely, she said finally, in a voice that had lost approximately half its certainty. How very lovely for you both. Lavinia Whitmore, who had come to stand near the window where she could see the garden in the April dusk, said nothing at all. After a moment she turned and looked at Cecily with an expression that was not warmth exactly, but was honest, and gave her a small nod. Cecily returned it. It was enough. It was the only exchange the occasion required. The drive home from Whitmore Hall was made in a carriage that felt different from the carriage of November. Same vehicle. Same road. The night outside was softer, the spring pressing through the dark with the particular insistence of an English April that has waited long enough. You did not have to say what you said, he said. I know. You were not obligated to defend my handling of the matter? No. She watched the dark fields. But I was right, and she was not. And I see no reason to stay quiet when I am right. A pause. She could see in the dim interior of the carriage that his expression was the open, unguarded one she had come to wait for. I did not choose well in the arrangement, he said. I chose logically, and I chose quickly, and I chose without attending sufficiently to who you were as a person. He paused. I am aware that this is not a recommendation. It is not, she agreed. I would choose differently now, he said. I would choose you. She was still for a moment. Then she said, You said a very similar thing at Whitmore Hall, in public, in front of Lady Whitmore. I think the public version has already been noted, and will do the necessary work. I am saying this one for myself. The carriage moved through the April night, and she turned to look at him. And he was watching her, with that expression that she had been translating in small increments across 6 months of marriage, and she thought she could read it now. It was the expression of a man who has spent 4 years being careful, and has arrived, with some surprise, at the edge of something he does not wish to be careful about. She reached across and put her hand over his, which was resting on the seat between them. His fingers turned and closed around hers with the same steadiness as March, and something in her chest settled into a warmth she recognized as not comfort, precisely, but resolution, the kind that comes at the end of a long question, when the answer has finally arrived and is simpler than you had been expecting, and is true. By June, the West Wing was fully open. The Holland cloth had come off the furniture. The curtains had been drawn back. A maid aired the rooms twice a week, and Mrs. Pendlewick had stopped wearing her expression of permanent mild anxiety, which Cecily understood to mean that the house had arrived somewhere the housekeeper had been waiting for it to arrive. Cecily played the piano. Badly at first, as she had warned. Her childhood lessons had left her with enough foundation to find her way around the instrument, but not enough to call it fluency, and she was not a woman who pretended to competence she did not have. She played simple pieces, and she played them slowly, and she made errors and corrected them. And every evening after dinner, The West Wing held the sound of someone practicing with honest effort rather than performance. He did not always come in. Sometimes she could hear him in the corridor, paused at the door she had crossed in March. And she played on and did not make it easier or harder. And eventually, he always came in and sat in the chair near the window and listened. He had not told her she played badly. He had not told her she played well. He had said once that the sound was different from what he remembered, which was what she had warned him. And she had said yes, it was. And he had said, in the tone of a man who is understanding something for the first time, that different was not loss. On a June evening, warm and late and full of the long light of a Shropshire summer, she was playing something she had found in the bench, a piece she did not know, in a hand that was not her own. She recognized, by the style of it, that it had been written here, not copied from a published score. She played it through twice, with the care it deserved, which was considerable. It was a quiet piece, the kind that did not announce itself, but accumulated, the kind that had been written by someone who understood that the best music is made for the room it lives in, rather than for any audience outside it. When she was finished, she sat with her hands in her lap, and after a moment she heard him cross the room and sit beside her on the bench, which was the first time he had sat beside her, rather than in the chair near the window. "She wrote that?" he said. "I know," Cecily said. "I could tell. I did not know it was in the bench. It was at the bottom, under several published volumes." She looked at the pages, which she had set on the music rest with the care she would have given any document of value. "I thought perhaps it was better played than left." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the evening birds were making their last commentary on the day. The light through the West Wing windows was the long amber of a June evening, the best light Ardenvale Park offered, and it fell across the keys and across their hands, resting in their respective laps, and across the pages of music on the rest. "Yes," he said at last. His voice was very low. "It is better played." He put his hand over hers. This time it was he who reached, and it was she who turned her hand and let his fingers close, and the warmth that moved through her was not the warmth of the carriage in April, which had been resolution. This was something else, something that had been building, in small increments, across every morning in the library, and every evening at the piano, and every careful conversation in drawing rooms and corridors and cold West Wing doorways. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was not conserved, not concentrated, not the expression of a man reviewing a legal document. It was the expression of a man who is not expected to want something and has discovered that he wants it absolutely. "Cecily," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her the way the piece had been written, which was without announcement and with considerable care. And the long light moved through the windows of the room that had been closed 4 years, and the house held them, and the music on the rest did not stir, in the mornings that followed, and in the evenings, and in the long middle passages of the days at Ardenvale Park. She played, and he listened, and the West Wing was open. Lady Whitmore was reported to have said to Mrs. Penrose in October that the new Countess had turned out to be not entirely what one would have expected for Ardenvale, but that one supposed there was something to be said for a woman who knew how to leave a thing in its own time. This was the most she was likely to concede, and Cecily, when it was reported to her by Dorothea on a visit in November, laughed for the first time in Lady Whitmore's presence, which was a sound the drawing-rooms of that neighborhood had not yet heard from her, and which turned out to be the thing people remembered most about her in the years that followed. The piano was played every evening. The West Wing door stood open. On a December morning, With the first snow coming down, soft and unhurried past the long gallery windows, Cecily stood in the corridor with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands and watched the light gather on the old brass fittings of the open door, gone green with verdigris, beautiful with age, and thought of a woman who had understood an estate better than anyone and who had left a piece of music in the bench for someone who came after to find. She thought she understood now what patience was. It was not the same as compliance. It was not the same as waiting. It was the willingness to be present in a room that was still becoming, to play a piece you had not written, in a house that was still opening itself, one room at a time, into something that might be called, in time, simply and entirely, home. The snow fell. The door stood open. Down the corridor from the west wing, she could hear him moving through the rooms, unhurried, present, entirely there. Thank you for staying to the end. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. There are more stories here, for those who wish to find them.